right, good. Let's move on to the power supply. That is, in mine, it's 551.45, but it's talking about the panel board or the panel. I guess we're talking about when in layman's terms, the power comes into the tiny house from usually a power cord, unless it's direct wired.
Right.
Power cord that plugs into the pedestal, and then the other end of this power cord goes into a panel board or a power supply of some kind. It says that here that the location of the panel board shall be installed in a readily accessible location within the RV or tiny house, as what we're talking about now, in the setup mode. Working clearances for the panel board with the tiny house in the setup mode shall be not less than 24 inches wide and 30 inches deep. What are they talking about there?
They're talking about accessible distances where a panel can be safely opened and worked on. So they're making sure that wherever you install it, it's not in such a tight spot to where you cannot easily access the panel. In a tiny house, it's usually up on a wall, probably recessed to where you can get to it. In some recreational vehicles or trailers, it could be right at, as you open the door, it could be down low on the right-hand side or left-hand side. It is easily accessible because the doorway is there. And you can be able to get into the panel without having constrictions to where you physically cannot do anything in the panel.
Can you
The
put
location is about accessibility.
Okay. Can you put a panel in a bathroom?
No, and they don't want you to do that because then you would have to ground fault the whole service, and then you're going to have to get a weather rated panel, and you're wasting a lot of money and causing a lot of issues. And in a shower, and you got a lot of water running, it does not just need to be rain tight, it also needs to be watertight. So now you're spending about $2,000 or $3,000 for a panel board, really not economically feasible. So don't put it in the shower. Put it in a shower location according to the National Electrical Code.
Yeah, but you did say you could put it down low.
You can put it down low.
You can, I mean, how low is
it? It has to be readily accessible. Now, when you think about it, like in a tiny home too, if you open up the door, it's elevated up because it's sitting on wheels. So it's really about waist height or something like that. It depends on how high it is off the ground. That is accessible right to the right or the left of that because there is a way to access the panel. Now, if you're in the tiny home, well, then that's a little bit different story because it's only a foot level. So normally, the more space you have, then they put it up at an accessible height in the hallway or somewhere where it's easily located. But in a tiny home, the definition of the word a tiny home is tiny. So therefore, you're trying to find a spot that you can put it that's easily accessible and doesn't cause any safety issues or accessibility problems. So it could be anywhere that you can find in that tiny home according to the layout of what you have for the tiny home to make it accessible so you can safely energize or de-energize or be able to work on that panel without causing harm to yourself or the home itself.
Okay. All right. But we're only allowed to have one.
Well, now these are manufactured, so when they leave, they're ready to go. But if someone's building one, I would get with the local inspector and see what they would like to see because interpretation of the code is done by the local jurisdiction of authority, and that's usually the local inspector. And if he don't like it or she don't like it, they may want you to change it. And there would be sound reasoning for that because they would tell you what that is.
So in other words, right now it's an RV on wheels and you're driving it around. But if you wanted to put it on a more permanent location, you might have to deal with the local city or the county municipality. And that inspector may say, yeah, I know the National Electric Code says this, but this is what I want done.
Yeah, and he's looking after the person that is occupying the space. It may be you at that time, but you may sell it. And they want to make sure in the future that someone that's not knowledgeable about electricity is safe.
So the city or the county official has the final say.
That is right. They have the last voice on if it's going to be approved or not approved. They call it jurisdiction having authority.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Okay, let's talk about the panel. We talked about location and clearances.
Yes.
We talked a little bit about the dead front. Does a panel have to have a main disconnect?
It depends on the code. If it is the only source that you have, then yes, it does have to have a main disconnect. But if you have a disconnecting means outside for the source, or the multiple power supply has a disconnect on that to turn all power off, within the panel does not have to have one.
What if I just my disconnect is I unplug the plug at the pedestal? Is that considered a main
Yes.
disconnect?
Actually, it is, because it is a portable device and you can unplug it, and that is a means of disconnect.
Interesting. Okay, that's
It
good
is.
news. I mean, I guess it's good
But
news.
again, a local inspector, if you decided to permanently install it, well, you probably want to pipe it into a local meter somewhere if it's going to stay on the property. But if you're going to use it en route and you're traveling to different places, that receptacle is a means of disconnect.
Okay,
That's
so in
why
other words,
stoves, you don't have to have a disconnect for a stove. It needs a means of disconnect because it's a piece of equipment. Well, we have it plugged into a cord in a wall to a receptacle. So if you unplug it, that's your means of disconnect.
interesting. Okay, so in other words, let me rephrase that. So you can have a main disconnect, say it's a 50 amp
Yes.
plug. You could have a 50 amp breaker inside the panel that would disconnect everything. Or if you don't have that and you just have, two 15 amp breakers and three 20 amp breakers, then your main disconnect could be the plug on the outside that you unplug at the pedestal.
Yeah. And when you get into the code on chapters 1 through 4, that's another thing that they talk about is 5 throws of the hand. And they're talking about how many disconnects can be in a panel, and you're talking about individual breakers. So if you have 5 breakers, you can turn all 5 off and the panel's de-energized. So there's ways of doing that. But primarily, you got to look at, if you have a fault and you're trying to de-energize that equipment, do you want to open the door, go outside and unplug it? Or do you want to go
Right.
to the main breaker and turn it off the panel? It's common sense.
Right. So yeah, it might be code to unplug it, but
Yes.
we're thinking sensible here too, and
Yes.
it just makes more sense to have a main breaker.
Right
And
there. The main breaker panels, with the economy, supply and demand, they're very economical, and it's worth having something with a main breaker, even though it's not required for code installation.
what's your feeling on the main panel, the breaker panel being on the inside as opposed to being on the outside in a weatherproof box?
Well, we're talking tiny. If I was talking about a house, that would be a different matter. But if I'm talking about a tiny house, you would want it on the inside. One thing for feasibility. Another thing is for weather exposure, because you don't know what type of climate that you're going to be in.
Okay. All right.
And it's accessible to other people when it's outside. People
Good.
carry bolt cutters, So if it's on the inside, they would have to come inside to disconnect the power.
Okay. It's not illegal to have one out there, but it just
No,
makes more sense to have it on the
it's
inside.
a matter of choice.